Hello, boys and girls. Today we are going to focus on mobilizing for defense, civic responsibility. Our essential question is, during war, what is the civic responsibility for those people who are not serving in the military? I know civic responsibility might be a term you're not too familiar with, but to me, I simply define it as the responsibility of a citizen. During the mobilization for the war, the U.S. sent a message that citizens had a responsibility to help their country. Last class, we covered how serving in the military was one way citizens could help win the war. Today, we're going to transition and look at how other citizens contributed to the war effort and the role the government played in linking the war front with the home front. If we are expanding the military, it is important that the country provided the men and women fighting with the weaponry to fight the Axis. Quick reminder, the Axis was Germany, Italy, and Japan. Additionally, we also had to supply these men and women with food and clothes. With this in mind, the U.S. government took many steps to seize control of both production of these goods and the economy. Beginning in February of 1942, it was announced that automobile production in the U.S. would completely shut down. The government seized control of this industry and retooled these factories to produce tanks, planes, boats, and other military supplies that were necessary. Ford had utilized the assembly line to produce goods, so the government hoped that there would be an easy transition and they could produce weapons at a similar rate. Not only did this happen to automobile factories, but numerous other types of factories were converted to war supply production factories. Looking at this chart here, you can see a dramatic increase in the production of U.S. Navy ships beginning in 1942. Reminder, Pearl Harbor happened in December 1941, so it took a little bit of time for production to have success. But as you can see, by 1944 and 1945, we're having a lot of success at providing Navy ships. By the end of the war in 1945, American civilians workers had built 14,000 ships, 88,000 tanks, 300,000 airplanes, and millions of guns. While creating all these war supply factories was an important step, many people feared that there would not be enough workers to meet military and industrial needs. They were wrong. By 1944, nearly 18 million workers were laboring in war industries, which were 3 times as many in 1941. Many citizens viewed it as their responsibility to fill these roles if they were not going to be overseas fighting. Last class, we discussed how minorities and women were eager to serve in the military. Their contributions during the war were not limited to just the battlefield. More than 6 million of these new workers were women who had been given little opportunities in industrial settings before. At first, many factory runners had concerns that women could meet the job demands required by factory workers. As you would expect, these false beliefs were quickly dismissed, and once a few women proved they could work as well as men, factory runners were eager to hire women because they only earned 60% as much as men did doing the same job. Defense plants also hired 2 million minority workers, but they also faced strong prejudice at first. Many defense plants refused to hire minorities or only gave them work that did not require much skill, such as janitorial services. In protest of this discrimination in the military and industry, A. Philip Randolph, one of the most respected African American labor leaders, organized a march on Washington. In July 1941, he called for all African Americans to march under the slogan, "We loyal colored Americans demand the right to work and fight for our country." The threat alone scared FDR, and he issued an executive order calling for employers and labor unions to hire people no matter their race, creed, color, or national origin. In fact, factories to produce consumer goods were being overtaken to produce war supplies. This meant that there would be less consumer goods to produce. With the demand for consumer goods still high but the supply low, this would lead prices of consumer goods to be very high. FDR realized this would be a challenge and created the Office of Price Administration to defeat this. The OPA fought inflation, or the increase in pricing and loss of value in money, by freezing the price of goods so the prices would stay the same. Instead of shoes and clothing reaching unrealistic prices, the prices would remain the same so that people could purchase them. The OPA also raised income tax rates and extended the tax to millions of people who had never worked before. This way they could generate more money for the war cause. As a result of having to pay taxes, there was less demand for the goods people normally would have wanted to purchase because they had less money to spend. Additionally, the OPA encouraged public to purchase war bonds with their extra cash. War bonds are loans that were used to support the war effort and keep inflation down. People who paid war bonds would receive the money back in time. The government also needed to ensure that the armed forces and war industries received the resources they needed to win the war. The War Production Board took the responsibility and decided which companies would convert from peacetime to wartime production and what industries would receive the raw materials. WPB also organized nationwide drives to collect iron, tin cans, papers, rags, and cooking fat that could be recycled to use for the war effort. Another system set up by the OPA was rationing. Rationing is establishing consumption or purchasing limits on goods deemed essential for the military. Looking at the left, households would receive ration books with coupons to be used for buying scarce products such as meat, shoes, sugars, coffee, and gasoline. In the image to the right, you will see that the home was rationed 2 pounds of sugar because the military in England, France, and Italy needed it. Rationing had certain challenges, but many citizens viewed it as their personal contribution to the war effort. If this meant they had to carpool or ride a bike to work because they could not buy gas, then so be it. Some people would cheat the system and buy ration items on the black market, but many people viewed it as their civic responsibility to accept rationing as their contribution to the war effort. Reflect back on our World War I unit and remember how the government used propaganda to earn support for the war. Propaganda can best be defined simply as a tool used to produce an emotional response. To explain these responsibilities and to encourage a voluntary spirit, the U.S. government launched the biggest advertising public relations campaign in history. Propaganda was used to convince people to enlist in the military, but also to convince civilians at home that they had certain civic responsibilities and roles that could help the U.S. win the war. Through the use of propaganda, the government was able to appeal to the emotions of the ordinary citizen and make them feel like they played a role in helping the U.S. win the war. Whether it was propaganda encouraging citizens to buy war bonds, work in factories to produce supplies, or to make decisions with conservation of important goods in mind, there was many propaganda efforts established. In class, we will work with some of these posters and examine the messages behind them. See you in class.